Today is all about how to bring wildlife into your garden this autumn and support the wildlife that is already there. It doesn't matter whether you've got a really large garden or a really tiny garden, or if you're really tight on time. These are brilliant small tasks that everyone can do that really make such a difference. Hey everyone, how's it going and welcome back. If you're anything like me, you're probably starting to notice that the bad weather days are outnumbering the good weather days. And because the days are getting shorter, there's less time to get things done in the garden. And because of that, we really need to make sure to make the best use of the time available. So I've got some great, really quick little things that you can do in the garden that you're gonna love. Because for me, as much as we spend time at this time of year preparing our gardens and the plants in them to get them through the winter and to ensure success next year, we need to be doing exactly the same for wildlife, attracting as much beneficial wildlife into our gardens as possible to boost the biodiversity and also support all of the biodiversity that we already have in our gardens. And for me, the reason for that is twofold. I think we all have a responsibility to look after the wildlife that's in our gardens and really try and support it, just as much as we look after, care for and support all of the plants in the garden. Because when you think about it, as much time as we spend out here, wildlife spends an awful lot more time out here because it's their home. And ultimately, our gardens, well, we really only ever have them on loan, so we are responsible for making sure that the environment is looked after. But on a much more practical level, having lots of beneficial wildlife is simply really good to have in the garden to keep your plants healthy and happy. For instance, I would have expected in a garden like this that we would be overrun with slugs, when in fact we have almost none. But what we do have a lot of are frogs, and it's those frogs that eat all of our slugs, and then I don't have a slug problem. So you can see that if you really work to bolster the wildlife, it's not only good for the environment, it's good for us as gardeners. One of the easiest and most accessible ways to increase the levels of biodiversity and wildlife in your garden is to feed birds. Putting out bird food at this time of year and through the winter is going to help sustain the birds that you already have in your garden and attract more in, because they truly are one of the garden's real allies, because they eat all kinds of pests, grubs, insects, so having them around is really beneficial for us as well as for nature itself. So to feed them, the easiest way is to buy bird food and bird feeders like these. Really, towards the end of autumn and into winter, birds need high-fat foods. Things like these fatty bird foods that you can buy, or peanuts, Niger seeds, or sunflower hearts. All of those kind of things are really going to help sustain the diet of those birds during the winter. I particularly like these fatty bird foods. The reason for that is they're nice and easy to fill up these containers with, and the birds go crazy for them. I was going to say the birds go nuts for them. The birds go crazy for them, and it means that they get eaten really quickly before they have a chance to get really rotten and horrible. When you're thinking about siting your bird feeders, make sure to site them nice and high. Obviously the birds can access them easily, but it keeps them well clear of ground level where predators may lie in wait to try and get the birds as they're feeding. The other way to feed birds, and for your next task, which I think you're going to love, involves you going to the garden centre and treating yourself to some really lovely plants, trees or shrubs that are going to bear fruit in the autumn and going into winter. Here we have a lovely rowan tree that's got beautiful yellow berries. We also have a crab apple with yellow fruits. Having those kind of fruits around in the autumn is going to give birds an extra source of food that they're going to love. So now that we've covered two different ways of feeding your birds, birds also need to drink. So for your next task, get yourself some nice shallow containers, fill them with water and leave them near to the food sources or places that your birds are going to be able to access them really easily. That way, the water is going to provide them with a place where they can drink if they need a little bit of water, and they can also bathe to keep themselves healthy. Just like the bird feeders, you do want to make sure that any kind of water you provide for birds is fresh and stays hygienic, so make sure to tip it out periodically and refresh it with nice clean water. Now that you have all of the nutrition needs of your birds boxed off, spare a thought about where they're going to live as well, and either make or buy a little bird box or even several bird boxes. You're not going to regret it. There is something so special about seeing birds coming and going when they're nesting in a bird box, and even better, if you time it right, you can see the baby birds fledging, and that is just brilliant. If you've already got a bird box, now is the time in autumn and winter to open it up and clear it out. Doing it now means that the bird box will be nice and empty for future birds to nest in next year, but at the same time, you don't risk opening it up when there are birds nesting in it. Hedgehogs truly are a precious animal to attract into your garden and to support. It's a brilliant thing for the environment, but it's also a brilliant thing for your garden because they eat all kinds of pests that just give us heartache, things like slugs and grubs. So here are 3 really easy ways to support them. The first thing that you can do is either buy or make a hedgehog house or a hedgehog shelter. It's really easy to find ones that you can buy online, and it's equally easy to find the instructions on how to make one. But ultimately what they need is a nice little shelter tucked away somewhere where they're going to be safe and undisturbed. In fact, last year we made a hedgehog shelter out of old roof tiles from the house, and it's tucked away in the hedge here. If making a shelter isn't necessarily your kind of thing, then my next recommendation, well, it might seem a little bit odd, but stick with me. A great thing to do at this time of year is to clear away dead plant material and old crops from your vegetable garden and things like that. Taking those crops and making a compost heap is such a good thing. Yes, it makes compost for us, but compost heaps are another place that hedgehogs love to hide in. Not only hide in, but hibernate. So if you can make a compost heap or several compost heaps, you're creating another habitat, another area in your garden that's going to be really attractive to hedgehogs. The last and probably easiest way to create a suitable habitat for hedgehogs is to simply leave some big piles of autumn leaves. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I made a video all about raking up your autumn leaves to make leaf mould. But spare a thought for the hedgehogs. Don't use up all of your autumn leaves. Instead, collect a whole load together and leave some nice piles of leaves alongside maybe some piles of sticks and logs. I've done exactly that here in this part of the garden, and this is going to create a really good habitat that will appeal to hedgehogs. Hedgehogs will actually shelter and even hibernate under large piles of leaves, so you can see just how easy it is in your own garden to create little pockets that hedgehogs are going to love. Okay, so we've looked after birds in your garden, we've looked after hedgehogs in your garden, and now it's time to look after the aquatic life in your garden, and in particular, frogs, because they are a brilliant thing to have around. And to do that, all we need to do at this time of year is maintain, optimize, and if you don't have it already, create some really good habitats for frogs to live and overwinter. Frogs, particularly male frogs, will actually continue to live over the winter at the base of your pond, where they can stay away from the coldest of the weather. But because of that, you want to make sure that the water stays good all the way through the winter. And to do that, my first task is to skim your pond. It is a job that truly only takes a couple of minutes, but lifting out dead leaves, and in my case, cooking apples, because we've got a cooking apple tree right next to the pond, means that all of this material isn't available to break down in the water. If this stuff is allowed to break down in the water, it increases the nutrient level, which you would think is a good thing, but it really isn't, because it can encourage overgrowths of algal bloom and things like that that will ultimately negatively impact on the living organisms in your pond. Every bit that you remove out of your pond like this helps to ensure that the water is going to stay nice and clean and fresh all the way through the winter. My next task that I'm going to recommend, and this is so easy, is to get a small ball, something like a tennis ball or a football, and float it on the surface of your pond, leaving it there all the way through the autumn, the winter, and into the spring. This tip is going to be well known to anybody that has a pond with fish in it, and the reason you do it is that it helps to delay the freezing of the surface of the pond water. Worst case, if the surface of the pond water was to freeze over entirely, ultimately the water underneath can start to deoxygenate. And you can imagine for living organisms, including frogs, that are hibernating at the very low levels of your pond, they can start to starve of oxygen. So having that ball just makes sure that your pond is less likely to freeze over. If it does really start to freeze over, it also allows you to lift that ball out and it leaves a nice little clear pocket of open water. And as well as having a pond, a great thing to do is to create an area close to your pond where frogs can shelter and hibernate outside of the water. And I've done this underneath this bench. You can see that underneath, I filled it with chopped up sections of log and sticks. That creates loads of lovely little hidey holes where frogs and all sorts of other creatures can hibernate, safe in the knowledge that they're well away from predators, they're sheltered from the very worst of the winter, they're going to get through the winter, and then they can enjoy next year. Bug boxes and bug hotels like this little thing are a brilliant way of helping beneficial insects and spiders over winter. And I think aside from anything, they look kind of cute as well. This one sits in a nook in one of our apple trees in the orchard, but if you get a number of these, you can dot them all the way around your garden. But if you don't want to go as far as getting one of these, you can make your own really easily. Either get some corrugated cardboard and roll it up, or get bamboo canes and chop them up. These will be perfect for overwintering bugs, and all you need to do now is either pop these into a piece of pipe, set them into a pot, or even just bind them together with some twine and tuck them away in some nice quiet secluded spots, whether it's in a tree or in a hedge, something like that, and your bugs will thank you. So I think you're going to like my next recommendation because it's a non-job, a non-task. I'm going to recommend that you don't do something that quite often as gardeners we really get stuck into at this time of year, and that's clearing away all of the dead plants, and particularly perennial plants like this. But actually, if you're just a little bit judicious about what you clear away and what you leave, it can really help support wildlife through the winter. Take something like this. This is an echinops or a globe thistle, and actually I think it looks really architectural even when it's brown and dry. But crucially, these seed heads are really going to help support birds because they can eat the seeds. As well as that, these spiky heads are actually going to create lovely little habitats for insects to overwinter in. So you can see that just leaving things alone really helps wildlife. You don't necessarily need to be actively doing something. Now, if you've still got itchy fingers and you want a nice gardening job to do, plant spring bulbs. Most of us think about doing that from an aesthetic point of view and having nice blooms early on in the spring. But actually those blooms are really good for supporting early pollinators. They provide the nectar that they need, and that's such a good thing to do. Now, I've made a couple of videos already about bulb planting. I made one this autumn all about how to create a brilliant lasagna planted bulb container, and I also made a video last year about planting my spring bulbs in the orchard really late in the season. Go and check them out. And until next time, I hope you really enjoy supporting the wildlife in your garden, and I'll see you soon.